So how do we deal with the local and the global in social research? I think that many of our students come to our discipline, human geography, because they see it as a place where you're encouraged to look at both the local and the global and in combination. And also that we have a language for talking about those relationships. So this is the topic of our conversation today, is to try to disentangle the local and the global, and also to talk about the concept of scale. And we have both worked with these concepts and tried to make use of them in our own research. Because when you look at the literature throughout geographical history, it is quite complex and it is quite hard to understand straight away what are these concepts and words about. So, do you want to say something about how you deal with the local and the global, Andrea?
Sure, yeah. You know, for me, as a feminist geographer, I'm really wary of creating a binary between the global and the local. Because for me, I'm not really sure where one begins and the other ends. But having said that, you're likely to hear me use the words local and global in their kind of common sense, everyday understanding. But that's different from if I'm wanting to use those words analytically. So if I need to use them analytically, then I need to make some theoretical distinctions between them that can bring more precision, but also help me maybe to understand something better. And so yeah, for me, this idea of local and global is something that I come into with a bit of, what's the right word? Not skepticism, but rather with sort of curiosity, and I'm wanting to kind of unpack them and understand better what they mean. And how about for you? Like, how do you understand these things?
No, this is the same experience I've had, that I came to know these words through everyday language. And it's only later on that I've started to think about them academically. And that makes local and global, I think, different from some other words that we use that are analytical to begin with. So growing up in Norway, how I met them was, I think, through the Gro Harlem Brundtland report in 1987, where everybody started talking about the local and the global, and particularly this saying, think globally, act locally.
Right.
And I looked at the document. It's nowhere to be found in the actual document, but still I think about this report as where it comes from. And it's an interesting phrase, think globally, act locally, because it seems to say something about the roles of the local and the global. So, but I'm not sure in hindsight whether I agree with the saying. So what do you think? Do you agree with this way of thinking about the local and the global?
Well, in some sense, it's useful for me because I think it captures my own understanding of the local and global being embedded within each other. But I think for me, what's maybe a bit different is that I almost think of the local as making up the global, as constituting the global. And I think globally, act locally sort of somehow implies that the global is the thing that came first. But I think when I talk about it, I mean, analytically, I mean something different than what that phrase is really all about. Because for me, it is much more about the way that whenever I'm defining the scale at which I'm going to do my research or which I'm going to operate, that is never isolated. It's always embedded within wider scales and a wider context. And I need to make sense of not only that wider context as context, but also kind of how it's influencing the scale that I am looking at in more detail, but also even just what it means that I might define it that way.
So I think that working with the local and the global as two distinct realms is maybe not so helpful. I think that's something we can agree on, and that as a binary, maybe it has this tendency of being equated with members of other binaries as well, like even think and act, or structure and agency.
Yeah.
I've also seen some making the point that the local and the global attaches to the capital and labor binary, where you have capital as a mobile, free-flowing, global phenomenon, whereas labor is place-bound and fixed, which is of course not true, but still corresponds to something intuitive in us.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned this word now, scale, and maybe that's a way of thinking of the local and the global as less distinct and more related. Is that how you make sense of it?
Yeah, I think we can go there. I mean, for me, scale's a sneaky concept. I think it's deceptively simple. And at the same time, I think a lot of geographers try to make it do more analytical work than it really can. And, you know, I think we're both familiar with some of the work of Jessup and Brenner that is really trying to, in fact, make that argument that there's other concepts in geography that need to be used in parallel with ideas of scale if we're going to really unpack the processes that we're interested in. But for me, scale refers to proportion, size or extent. What's interesting about it to me is that usually these kind of proportions that we create, like local, global, have some basis in reality. You know, we experience the world through our bodies, and the proportions that we experience come from our senses and that embodied understanding of the world. And so in that sense, they're real. But for me, they're not something that's out there to be discovered. There's something that we construct to make sense of the world, that we need patterns, we need understanding, and it's very possible to imagine other kind of proportions. And in fact, for me, what is most interesting sometimes is to kind of deliberately try to shift the frame. Okay, what if I think about these as actually having a different set of proportions? A bit like my comment of what if it's the local that makes the global, rather than the local being a subset of the global somehow or derived from the global. So for me, it's that way. But what about you? How do you understand scale? And
I think I come from a different place, and I've learned about scale in geography in a different way. And I think that there is a distinction here that has also been made by others of scale as an epistemological way of viewing the world, like you're talking about now, and scale as an ontological phenomenon, which I think is probably the way I've worked with that concept the most, as something that is discerned in our own research, in our encounter with the social world, as scalar constructs. For instance, the establishment of relationships between a city and a nation state, which would be like an obvious and a basic scalar relationship. And so yeah, I think that's a distinction, and I think both are probably useful ways of talking about it. But as a student, you can be quite confused when you see those things being consumed into the same word, scale.
Right.
But maybe before I say something more about this ontological way of thinking about scale, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on scale as epistemology, because that is really, as a discipline, that's where scale came into the mix to begin with, isn't it? I mean, many centuries ago.
Absolutely. I mean, the origins of scale in geography, and probably even within science in general, comes from maps. And it came from the initial desire and need, if you will, to represent the world in a two-dimensional space. And so there's a scale on a map tells you how many centimeters on this two-dimensional plane on the piece of paper corresponds to how many meters or even kilometers or whatever on the ground. And what's of course interesting about that is that making those translations is not at all simple. And in a place like here in Norway, where we have a lot of mountains, in fact, that kind of vertical as well as horizontal distance has been one of the really big challenges to making good maps. And in fact was a significant problem in GIS systems, in how could they get GIS systems to deal with topographical relief, and what would it mean when they tried to change scale within that. So yeah, absolutely, maps were really important. But for me, scale is not just material. It often is. Scale's often referring to material things. The nation state versus the county. We can map out their size on the ground. I mean, they're defined spaces, if you will. But they're also they can also be abstract. So for me, I've thought about scales of knowledges. So how is knowledge scaled? Where does, what is the size or scope or extent of the knowledge that I have as a local person? That's not actually just within my locality. My knowledge comes from a much wider scope than that. But I think you can also think about it in terms of some of these political levels that we are accustomed to. So the county, for example, here in Norway, counties aren't necessarily the same square kilometers, each of them. But the scale of governance is the same. They have the same responsibilities for the same kind of, activities for the population, health, education, roads, whatever. It's like these things are kind of dictated within the county scale. And that doesn't necessarily need to be consistent with how big they are on the ground.
I noticed that you use the words scale and level. And I know that you have also written about the relationship between these two concepts, or how they can be put to use, which is funny because I remember as a PhD student, a fellow PhD student told me, never use the word level in geography, we use scale. And I didn't reflect on it much, but I think I stuck to scale more or less. But you seem to find use for both.
Yeah.
Can you say something more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, again, scale is about proportional relationships. They don't have to be quantifiable, but they often are. They're about size, scope, extent, and level are points within a scale. And so they're always socially constructed. They're things that we define. And again, I want to go back to and say that often they reflect proportions and relationships and obvious points within a scale that we experience. So it's not like they're just made up. But at the same time, they're not necessarily obvious. Other ones could be imagined. And so, for example, if we're talking about the national scale, within that scale, you have the level of the county and the municipality here in Norway. But what's interesting about it for me is that, like my earlier example, the county itself can also be understood as a scale. And the levels within that might refer more to health, education, transportation, whatever sorts of activities the county is actually responsible for governing and delivering on. Those would be the level, and the scale would be the county. But if we're thinking about national level or national scale responsibilities, then the county becomes a level. What's going on at the county level in terms of dealing with those things?
Exactly. And I think this is where, when I made this distinction between epistemology and ontology, how we view it and how we say that it is, I think this is getting blurred now. And maybe that's important to recognize. So when I talk about scale as a social construction in the world, I understand that it is also about how I frame my study, for instance. So if we want to understand something that happens in Oslo, we are saying in this study, Oslo is the case, and we make some demarcations in time and space to make sense of what we do. But at the same time, scale corresponds to something like a dynamic, a travel to work area, for instance, or other material and social relations that seem to create some kind of urban scale, which again, like you say, correspond to other scales. They might be the levels of the state apparatus and many other scalar constructs. And if we look at the scale debate, which has followed the discipline for at least 30 years, it has gone through different phases where it talks about scale in different ways. It looks for metaphors. And I think it it's interesting to even start with the more rudimentary ways of thinking about these basic scales. Peter Taylor, for instance, who made a distinction between the urban scale as the scale of experience that we meet and encounter every day, make sense of our everyday lives, and then the national as a scale of ideology, as the kind of the frame that we are as a population are meant to understand the world through press and school and other things. And then global as the scale of reality, as we as social scientists, I suppose, should understand the world. And then from that, we have discussed what scale really is, discussed whether it works best as a ladder metaphor, where the local is kind of below, scales above them like the national or the global, which is quite intuitive, but at the same time also slightly problematic, because it tends to imply that whatever is on top of that ladder is more powerful than the local, which is not often the case. And the global is not always a very powerful level of decision-making, for instance. There are other metaphors like the concentric circles or the Russian dolls, where they seem to be distinct yet within each other. More recently, I think there is a more dominant thinking of network metaphors, thinking about them as root systems or branches or rhizomes. Thanks for pronouncing it, because I don't know how to say it. Which kind of emphasizes the connections. But possibly are not so clear in showing us how things are vertically ordered, which sometimes is the social reality that we are facing.
Right. And I think for me, that's a great kind of segue into what I have worked on with scale, which is around scales of knowledge, which I mentioned earlier. And there, for me, it's been about looking at, a lot of geographers are interested in local knowledge, and a lot of our master's students will in fact do projects that have some component where they're trying to gain local knowledge about a problem. And for me, I'm also interested in local knowledge, but local knowledge is not scaled locally. What's local about local knowledge is the level at which the actors are working or acting or making claims. So they're local, but their knowledge is multiscalar, because I don't think today that there's any knowledges out there left in the world that are not in some way influenced by other knowledges. Science, I think we can make a fairly compelling argument, is a global knowledge, just because the way it travels, and science and technology studies have looked at this and made arguments about it. But that it'll be informed by understanding, thinking, data from multiple scales and multiple levels, and all of that is bound up in local knowledge. And I think we really miss something when we assume that local knowledge is just about our experience and understanding of that immediate everyday context where these actors are coming from. And I think we can also understand more how we can get scale mismatches between what this knowledge is trying to promote or advocate and what that knowledge is trying to promote and advocate. And so for me, there's a verticality to it that comes out of power, because actors that are claiming to be global or to promote global understandings, that's a particular exertion of power, if you will, as well as coming from a powerful place to make those claims. And the local sometimes gets either glorified or subsumed to that. And I'm more curious about how they're both multiscalar, and it's just the level at which actors work.
That makes sense to me, and it corresponds to research I'm doing, which is in a very different subject, and it deals with labor, and it deals with how workers are represented in a workplace. So it has very little to do with Nepal and forestry, but still I find the same concepts scale useful to make sense of what is going on in workplaces that are anything but local in the sense that you're talking about. They are made up of migration flows. They are governed in part by directives made far away from Norway. They are very vulnerable to fluctuations in the global economy. They're part of global production networks and so on and so forth. And to really understand how a worker can make herself or himself represented, take part in something collective, which is my main interest in these workplaces, you really have to understand these scalar relationships. And sometimes they are inhibited by scale mismatches. And sometimes these scale mismatches might even be partly of their own making, in the sense that unions have always been, at least in Norway, very strong in making their demands placed at the national scale, engaging with national policymakers, being a very strong union federation. And then sometimes you might even win a concession that makes the local scale become ever more important. You need to have very resourceful, competent local union shop stewards. But if you have built your organization around becoming a very strong national union, that's not a given. Suddenly you have to think very different within your organization. And in that situation, scale becomes a useful way of making sense of what is a problem, a social problem.
Right. Yeah. Well, and another really interesting, I think now we're starting to get into the way that scale is used analytically in geography. And, one of the interesting concepts that came out in the 1990s was Neil Smith's idea of scale jumping. And one of the examples that I love, it wasn't an example that Neil himself used, but that I think illustrates this really well, comes from the Chiapas movement in Mexico. So Chiapas indigenous people have been agitating for decades now for rights and protection over their rainforest and their way of being in relationship to the Mexican state. And they really were not getting very far. They were having a difficult time resisting what the Mexican state was wanting to do. And what was effective was when they scale jumped and they went global. So they went and they got allies, other social movements, etc., at a global scale or global level to come and take on their cause and pressure the Mexican state. So now they were able to actually work across scale, and they weren't sort of confined to the local level within their sort of political effectiveness, if you will. And so that's a somewhat different example than yours of the labor unions, but it's the same problem of like, okay, what is the scale at which we want to be pitching our actions? And I think we can take this into research, right? These are questions that all research projects need to ask.
And you almost become enthusiastic as a geographer, because it's one of those occasions where the spatial seems to be a very important part of the explanation. Yeah. So we have something to offer in terms of making better sense of what is going on.
Right, exactly. And so one of the questions in my mind, and I think that most our audience is going to be asking, is, okay, so I'm writing a master's thesis or maybe even a bachelor's thesis. So what does scale mean for me? And I think one of the messages I would give is that scale is it's never innocent. The scale at which you choose to operate, the scale at which you choose to define your study, it always has some kind of consequences, analytically and politically. But there is a difference between that initial choice of, okay, what's the scale, what's the scope of my study, and the sort of politics and analytical implications of those choices that you make, and then trying to use scale analytically in the research itself. And those are kind of two separate things. And I think it's important for students to realize they don't have to use scale analytically, might not be that important, but nevertheless, there is this analytical moment where you need to think through the consequences of how you're scaling your study.
That's well put, and I think that's a very good way to end this conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we hope that this has given you a better understanding into some of these concepts around local, global, and scale and level, and a better idea of what they might mean for your own research projects. Thanks, David.
Well, thanks, Andrea. Andrea, you are now on tape having called scale a sneaky concept and never innocent. Are you ready to face the legal consequences when this goes online?
Yeah, I hope so. I think it's all good.